Good morning, everyone. The topic of my final paper is the women of Nueva Cancion, Nueva Cancionera, and Musica Folclorica, which translates to the women of new song book, and folkloric music. The goal of my project was to examine the role of women in various musical landscapes of the Andes Mountains in Chile, Argentina, Peru, and Bolivia, with attention to stylistic and artistic overlaps and parallels. So as you listen to the different clips I'll show, just try to pay attention to the instruments you hear and the type of vocal techniques that people use. Before I talk about the musical figures in Andean music, I want to give some background to what music looked like in the 20th century of these four countries. And the reason why I selected them is because they all sit on the Andes Mountains, which are the longest continental mountain range in the world, stretching from Colombia all the way down into Chile. You may have learned about the Andes when you learned about the Incan Empire, which was a 100-year-long empire that united different ethnic groups and villages across hundreds of miles until Spanish conquistadors landed in the 16th century. And for this reason, the demographics of the Andes and South America at large are an unbelievable melting pot, but very connected continent in terms of their demographics, made up primarily of European, indigenous, and African roots. My mom is from Peru, and she grew up in a region called Ancash, high up in the mountains. And I grew up listening to some of the music you'll hear from Peru and Bolivia, which can be referred to with the blanket term Musica Folclorica. Chile and Argentina differ slightly in their demographics in that they have a smaller proportion of indigenous people in their modern-day populations and in the past 100 or 200 years or so, making it so that up until the eras of Nueva Cancion and Nuevo Cancionero, their music was arguably more European, but with some folk elements that emerged under the wing and impetus driven by the women that we'll discuss. Initially, it was very hard to find women in traditional music in Peru and Bolivia, despite how women were involved in dance. And while analyzing how different these countries are, it's also important to look at how similar they were. For example, in Peru, there's a very famous dance called marinera. And in marinera, the women are dressed in these Spaniard-looking dresses, and it's very similar to cueca, which is danced in Chile, the only difference being that the women are in heels. And it's a bit slower. And you can compare this to the Argentine tango, which is very famous. And this all contrasts really well to a very traditional dance, mostly performed in Bolivia, but also in Peru, called caporales or saya. This song is called Llorando se fue, Crying She Went, by a very popular indigenous group from Bolivia called Los Jarcas. And unlike in the marinera songs and the band behind those dances, you can hear something called a zampoña, or sometimes the quena. Zampoña is a pan flute, and then a quena is a wooden recorder of some sort. And those are indigenous instruments that people like moving into Violeta Parra brought back to the forefront of the musical landscapes of these Andean countries. So Violeta Parra was a pioneer of Nueva Cancion. And Nueva Cancion was a folk music revival movement in Chile. And she spent a lot of time in rural Chile collecting music and stories and poems and experiences of the indigenous people. And this molded her folk music sound. And her music, while she herself didn't really use it as a political tool, so to speak, was used by her contemporaries and those that came after her, particularly to contest the brutal dictatorship of Pinochet. And her music was used for particularly the populist leader Salvador Allende, who was overthrown by Pinochet. Some of her most famous songs are Gracias a la Vida, Thank You to Life, and Volver a los 17, which is Return to her youth. And these were songs that she reminisced about her young life. And this is Gracias a la Vida.
Gracias a la vida que me ha dado tanto, me dio dos luceros que cuando los abro perfecto distingo lo negro del blanco y en el alto cielo su fondo.
So this song was very much covered by lots of artists to come after her very untimely death. And she inspired, arguably, her contemporary Mercedes Sosa, who was an Argentine woman of Aymara heritage, and she was a contributor and signer of El Manifesto del Nuevo Cancionero. So they put this into writing, that they wanted to bring folk music back to the forefront of Argentina. And her music, like Violeta, was very simple. For example, in Gracias a la Vida, she is only playing a charango, that stringed instrument, and the focus is on her lyrics and her voice. And Mercedes often would perform with just her guitar or charango accompanist on stage. And her songs were arguably more powerful in that they were very politically directed about her visions of hope and justice and for a democratic Argentina. This excerpt is Solo le pido a Dios, I only ask of God. So this was much later in Mercedes Sosa's career, and she had a band, but again, their music is focused on the very simple instruments. And while they were instrumental in transforming music in Chile and Argentina and bringing it back to its Andean roots, I wanted to also look at Peru and Bolivia, where I actually really could not find very many women. I grew up listening to music like this, which is even arguably more traditional, because Peru and Bolivia didn't go through a revival per se. So this is one band, and the bands usually were mostly men, one of the most prominent being Los Jarcas. This is one of their songs, Tiempo al Tiempo. And you can hear charango, pan flute, and quena, which is the recorder. So this, like some of the other songs, they're very romantic, not necessarily politically or like they're not of the same nature necessarily of Violeta Parra, but in terms of instrumentation, they're very similar. I was lucky enough to find a all-female group, which is very rare. Hijas del Sol, they used to be called Las Chicas del Sol, which mean daughters of the sun, and the sun is very representative and important in old Andean tradition because the sun was Inti, the sun god. So here they're accompanying some caporales and saya dancers that we saw earlier in Llorando Se Fue. And the significance of this is that despite having very similar fundamental musical elements, I was very surprised to find that women in Peru and Bolivia were almost like erased from or non-existent in the musical folkloric scene compared to people like Violeta Parra and Mercedes Sosa that were at the forefront of bringing folkloric music back to their musical respective countries. So that was interesting, but it is very inspiring to see women like Hijas del Sol coming to the forefront, and they're very new, have been around for maybe less than 10 years. But this was a very insightful project, and I was glad to get to focus on it. Thank you.